Welcome to the 425th episode of the Jami Dulaney Plant-Based Wellness Podcast. My name is Jami Dulaney, and I'm your host. I'm a plant-based cardiologist and endurance athlete living in Southwest Florida. One more weekend until Brazo Bend 50 miler. Got another one coming up. So we've had some cool weather here in Florida. It's been nice training, but the high 80s are coming in the next few days, and I think it's going to be hot in Texas. So it'll give us time to practice taking in nutrition in hot weather. So it's always good. Little chance of rain, but who knows between now and then. But nevertheless, I think I'm ready as I can be. I haven't fallen down, knock on wood, in the last couple of months. So I'm ready to roll. And then after that, we'll be full bore ahead training for the Silver Rush 50-mile race in Leadville in July. So I can't wait for that to happen. In looking at Leadville posts and things, I came across a man on mental training named Travis Macy. And Travis is going to actually join, he and his father are going to join me next week because he has a new book out, not only on mental training, but this book is called A Mile at a Time, and it is a chronicle of his dad's journey with Alzheimer's. Mark Macy is a prolific endurance racer. He's been in eco challenges. He's synonymous with endurance athlete events, ranging from day races and eco challenges and on and on and on. And we'll talk more about that. But he was diagnosed at an early age, around 60, with Alzheimer's. And he and his son, Mark, are being very open about his progress and how it's affecting him and the things that he is doing to manage his Alzheimer's and to keep moving forward. And it's a very touching book. They're, again, quite candid and open about a topic that a lot of times people are reluctant to talk about. I think it's going to be a great interview. I strongly encourage you to listen to this one. It's coming up next week. It'll probably try to get it up next week. It's probably going to be a tough interview for me because my father passed secondary to Alzheimer's. And a lot of things in the book, kind of triggered experiences that I had with my dad growing up and the closest we had. And it was a little different for me with my dad having Alzheimer's. My parents live in the same house. They have their own apartment, but they live under the same roof as I do, so it made it easier to care for my dad. My mom actually was undergoing treatment for lymphoma part of the time. She successfully beat that, but my dad ultimately succumbed to Alzheimer's. And it was difficult being a daughter and a physician. I wasn't his neurologist primarily, but I was the doctor of the family and looked upon to do something. And it was very frustrating when at times, and ultimately there was nothing I could do. But I think, I look back on our last days together very fondly, and I think that Mark, in his chronicle with his dad, is also looking at the beauty of preserving a relationship that you have with someone with Alzheimer's. And, maybe it's such that the person with Alzheimer's just lets somebody else carry the short-term memory for a while, because the memories always go on and people will always have the memories. And so it's nice to be able to share and enjoy day to day. And I think if anything can be taken away from his story, and of course we'll talk about it more, is that, every day is precious and we should enjoy every day. Not worry so much about tomorrow because we don't know what tomorrow brings, but making the best out of today and giving it all you got. So they're endurance athletes giving it all they got still. I'm an endurance athlete giving it all I've got still, and that's the way we're going to roll. So that'll be next week. So I hope you'll tune in for that. Published this week was a paper on obesity and a little bit of an argument back and forth on genetics versus environment. Certainly there's a role of genetics in obesity, but you can say have genes changed that much over the past 20 years because there's been a marked rise in the actually more than 20 years, but probably since the 80s in the incidence of obesity in especially the United States population. And has our genetics changed? Probably not, but our environment certainly has changed with the more fast foods, more energy-dense foods, more availability of poor quality foods, so that people that have a genetic tendency, be it to extract more energy from food perhaps, have a greater hunger drive, less satiety drive. Certainly it makes it more difficult for these people in the environment that we live in today. The problem with food is that you've got to eat some, and so it's hard to control what you eat. And I think, one of the things that I look at with most lifestyle diseases is it's multifactorial, meaning that there's nothing really happens in isolation. There's more than one reason for things to occur. And again, in the incidence of obesity, if people were eating like they did in the 60s and there wasn't the fast food and there was limited amounts of processed food, certainly the control would be a lot easier. And, I think sometimes the media, everybody plays a role in trying to make people feel perhaps good about their bad habits. But, I guess some foods some people can't eat. Probably some foods no one should eat. But certainly some foods take their toll on some people to a much greater extent. And I think that occurs with obesity as well as cancer, as well as heart disease. So we all are individuals to some degree, but the food that we're exposed to is just about how much of a bad food that you can tolerate. And maybe the wisest choice would be to try to avoid some of these bad foods altogether for all of us. And even when you look in the context of Alzheimer's is often labeled type 3 diabetes, and that certainly glucose metabolism in the brain might be as bad as the accumulation of tangles and tau and different amyloid fibers. So again, most Alzheimer's, most dementia are multifactorial. Whether there's a vascular impairment, people throw sugar under the bus, they hook sugar and carbohydrates together, and this thought is, should we be eating a high-fat diet? But again, the etiology of diabetes is the impairment of glucose absorption, secondary to the receptor being blocked with fat. And if you look at brain health, certainly there's a cholesterol component to it. So especially when you look at microvascular disease, increased fat, decreased glucose metabolism. So it kind of all goes together, and that a healthy diet is going to be helpful in the prevention of dementia and Alzheimer's, much more than these fringe diets, high fat and watching out for sugar altogether. Our brain runs on carbohydrate. We just need to figure out how to make the brain of people with dementia use the carbohydrates better. So a lot of research going on, and we'll talk about some of the options for treatment. But I'm still of the mindset that a plant-based diet and new studies are coming out all the time showing that a plant-based diet is still very much beneficial and certainly not harmful to people with dementia. So I'm sure that's going to come up next week to some degree. I heard an endurance athlete talking about his digestion problems and his indigestion that he's had from an early age, and it brought up what crosses my physician's doorway almost on a daily basis, and was personal for me, is the intake of oil and indigestion. Oil can really lead to a lot of inflammation in, again, people that are predisposed, but a lot of people. And sometimes people think that, as he did, that spicy foods are the cause, but it's really spicy foods in the presence of oil that cause the problem. I know from a personal standpoint, a familial standpoint, my grandfather had indigestion, my mother had indigestion, I got indigestion, and so it was thought to be some sort of, hereditary thing going on. But when I gave up oil, my indigestion went away, and I could eat as hot and spicy foods as I could tolerate without, sneezing and my nose running, and was able to get off of medications for indigestion. And my mother, at 80 years of age, when she gave up oil, was able to cure her indigestion and eat as spicy of foods as she wants. And numerous people that have come in the office with indigestion, I've not had a failure yet for people that got off of oils, especially processed oils, high fatty foods, that their indigestion didn't go away. And if you've ever suffered from GERD, gastroesophageal reflux, it can feel like a heart attack, and you can be pretty miserable with it. And a lot of people avoid a lot of good foods because of it. But I'll give you a hint: give up oil, and it'll be all right. It's a main concern for me when I'm looking at running this long 100-mile races, where people talk about needing a little bit of a fat source to take in. For calories, to be able to get in enough calories to go the 100-mile distance. And I'm thinking what fat I could take in that wouldn't cause indigestion, or low enough that it wouldn't cause me other problems. And it's pretty hard to come up with one, but I think avocado may be where I'm going to look into, because it's a monounsaturated fat for the most part. And so I'll probably try to use some of that with carbohydrates, because avocado doesn't seem to bother me like a processed oil would. I don't eat a lot of bars that have a lot of oil in them, because those can cause me indigestion. A lot of the gels that have nut butters in cause me indigestion, or added coconut oil can cause me indigestion. So if you suffer from GI issues, you might want to look at the added oils into things that are causing you problems. One thing I haven't talked about much is soy, and there was a recent review of the literature concerning soy products that was quite extensive, and I found quite interesting. Few tidbits that I really didn't know the nitty-gritty details on, so I'd like to share with you. First of all, when we look at soy, I'm going to lump it all together, whether it's tempeh, tofu, miso, soybean oil, soy protein isolate. Most of the studies lump a lot of those together when they look at them. Some break them down into their various nutrient components, but a lot of them overall look at just people's soy intake in general. But certainly soy products are a great source of protein. When people are worried about you getting adequate protein because you're on this plant-based diet, soy is the highest, especially soybeans, the highest bean amount of protein per serving. They're also equivalent to meat servings when it comes to protein intake. So, that can be your answer to that question. Everybody gets wigged out about that word tofu or tempeh, but the reality of it is the protein is very adequate and quite good and very well digested. There are some people that argue that it's not a completely digestible protein, but those controversies have been largely laid to rest, and there's no big governing body that thinks anything different than soy protein is very digestible. Soy is one of the highest highest calcium-containing foods in the legume family, soybeans. Very good source of calcium, which leads to a decreased risk of osteoporosis, improved bone health. It's also a good source of absorbable iron. Again, people are worried that on a plant-based diet that you will become anemic, but don't fail to realize that all iron comes from the ground, and plants have iron in a very adequate supply, and soybeans do extensively. The other nutrients that are high in soy products are zinc and potassium and phosphorus. Again, all good minerals and nutrients that are readily absorbable. when we think about beans, sometimes we don't think about the carbohydrate portion of beans. The beans certainly have a lot of protein in them, but they also have a carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate in soybeans is an oligosaccharide. And, a carbohydrate's made up of carbon, hydrogen, and water, and they're just different length chains. And oligo means multiple chain or multiple glucose molecules hooked together. The starch is starchiose is the main oligosaccharide in soybeans, and interestingly, it actually stimulates the growth of a good bacteria called bifidobacteria, and to the point where it's actually classified as a prebiotic. So certainly tempeh and miso have more because they're fermented, but any soy product is classified as a prebiotic because of the oligosaccharide that they contain. There is fat in soybeans, 10 to 15% saturated fat. There is 19 to 41% monounsaturated fat. This varies on the processing of the soy product versus soybeans versus tempeh, etc. Most of the fat are polyunsaturated fatty acids in the form of omega-6s and omega-3s. There's a lot of controversy with regard to omega-6s. Omega-6s ultimately go to make more inflammatory compounds, more clotting compounds than omega-3s. Omega-3s are more anti-inflammatory, anti-clotting. But the research suggests that if a compound has a good ratio of omega-3s to omega-6, such as soybeans, about 1 to 7, that the risk of inflammation goes way down and probably in the opposite direction. So that is another good aspect of soy consumption. Most people know about the isoflavones in soy products. It's one of the reasons why it's thought that Japanese and Asians have less breast cancer, prostate cancer than U.S. and European counterparts. Interestingly, the consumption of isoflavones in Japan is about 30 to 50 milligrams per day. In the U.S., it's less than 3 milligrams per day. So, our diet is truly lacking in these very protective phytonutrients. The more something is fermented, the more isoflavones it has. Some people worry that they're more of an estrogen modulator and will stimulate estrogen growth, particularly in breast cancers, but they bind mainly to a beta estrogen receptor. They're more of an estrogen blocker per se, and that the overall decrease the risk of breast and uterine cancer. There's no adverse effect in the thyroid. If someone is taking thyroid replacement, since the soy products can decrease the absorption of the medication, so you should take the medication on an empty stomach anyway. But as long as you're eating your tofu egg sandwich a few hours after you take your thyroid medicine, you shouldn't have any problems. Interestingly, soy decreases total cholesterol as well as low density LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, somewhere around 3 to 5%. Doesn't seem like much, but that is more than statins for the most part. When you look at a statin study and they say there's a 30 to 40% reduction, they are looking at absolute risk reduction, they're looking at relative, not absolute reduction. There's about a 5% decrease in triglycerides. There's an increase in good cholesterol, HDL, about 1 to 3%. So very effective in improving the lipid profile. They've also been noted to lower blood pressure by 2 to 5 millimeters of mercury, systolic pressure, which can be very substantial. And with that, the risk of overall coronary health, or I should say cardiac heart disease events, about a 5 to 9% reduction, and about a 6 to 14% reduction in strokes. So again, very protective from the cardiovascular standpoint. If you look at endothelial function, that's the blood vessel's ability to make nitric oxide and dilate. That also improves with soy intake, decrease arterial stiffness. So as we get older, the arteries start to be stiff. They don't make as much, the endothelium doesn't make as much nitric oxide. Blood pressure goes up. Soy helps to combat that. One of the things you may have had measured C-reactive protein that looks at total body inflammation. Soy consumption has been shown to decrease C-reactive protein. So when I'm saying all these things, not only am I saying, you say, well, maybe it doesn't do it that much, but the fact of the matter is the bad markers are going down, the protective effect is going up, versus, I'll say, red meat, where we know that there's no protective benefit. So nobody says go out, except a few carnivore people out there that are out of their minds, go out and eat a bunch of red meat to improve your overall risk and decrease your risk of cancer. It's not out there. So not only does soy products not increase risk of bad things, but we're seeing a decrease in the risk of bad things happening. There was a study looking at the thickness of carotid artery, the intima or the endothelial thickness of the wall of the carotid artery, also shown to decrease with increased soy consumption. This was most advantageous in postmenopausal women. In the postmenopausal, especially early postmenopausal time period, is where women see the steepest rise of vascular events and carotid disease and intimal thickening. So this combats that. So, taking in soy products is a great menopause medication. It also lowers the incidence of hot flashes. Decreases the risk of breast cancer. So there's really not a better drug or a better food to start taking if you don't actively eat a lot of soy than at the time of menopause. When people have had a stroke and they've looked at neuron damage, permanent damage to the nerves, they've also noted that the increase of soy products is associated with decreased persistent nerve damage, so that's another good thing. Bone health, people worry about osteoporosis, 33% in decreased fracture rate with increased soy taking. Also improved bone turnover, which is you're taking down old bone, laying down new bone, which is very protective, increases with soy intake. The calcium uptake in bone is increased with soy intake. So again, overall bone health in multiple ways is improved with soy intake. So soybeans, miso, tempeh, tofu, soy milk, whatever your passion is. Again, breast cancer, especially earlier in life, associated with a 25 to 60% reduction in breast cancer. So if you have a granddaughter, if you have a daughter, they should be taking in a lot of soy products. You get rid of the almond milk, give them soy milk. Get rid of the meat, give them tofu. Get rid of, make soy yogurt. Any way you can get soy into young girls is very protective against breast cancer. Add that onto the improved microbiome and possible decreased risk of obesity. You're tremendously affecting the risk of breast cancer in young girls. If someone has breast cancer, the invasiveness of recurrence is much less. The 5-year prognosis in breast cancer is improved with soy intake. There was a pretty large study with 11,000 women, decreased recurrence of breast cancer, decreased mortality associated with soy intake. It actually amplifies tamoxifen. It doesn't inhibit tamoxifen if taken with it. There was a couple studies that showed it to be as an equivalent of tamoxifen. Decrease in metastatic prostate cancer. Less stress as far as a protein on kidney function. We know that people that have renal insufficiency, the more protein they take in, the quicker they get to have a need for dialysis. Not so in the case of soy protein. So it's a good way for kidney failure patients or patients with decreased kidney function to actually protect their kidneys. And last, but certainly not least, is skin health. Decrease in wrinkles, improved elasticity, improved water retention into the skin, decrease in pigmentation as far as, those age spot things. Actually, an improvement of hair follicles. So if you're losing your hair, eat more soy. There's really not a downside to eating soy. They even looked at soybean oil, which 40% of isoflavones taken in the United States comes from soybean oil and products. The thing you have to watch out for is genetically modified soybean oil. So when you get a bar or something that has soybean oil, make sure it's a non-GMO, organic type of product. Same way with tofu. Most of the tofu is non-GMO and organic, but make sure that is part of it, which should be part of every vegetable that you eat. You want to avoid genetically modified so that they're decreasing your consumption of pesticides and Roundup that will ultimately affect your microbiome. So all good news when it comes to soy. Personally, I am a fan of tofu, tempeh, and soy milk are my three biggies. What I take in. I don't eat as much tempeh as I like. My mom's not a real big fan of the fermentation taste of it, so we probably eat more tofu. I like to make if you do creamy fillings or cheese sauces with or even mousses and puddings with the silken tofu. So you can make desserts. You're getting your kids a healthy treat. Put some cacao powder in there, and makes a great pudding, a great filling for stuffed shells without the cacao powder, obviously. So there's multiple ways to use the silken tofu. The extra firm, you can make crumbles and put it in soups. It can be baked to make it crunchy on the outside. It can be added to stir fries. We like tofu egg sandwich. I believe that is my invention, where I take a slice of tofu and marinate it in mustard, garlic, turmeric, a little cumin, maybe a little smoked paprika, and a little bit of sulfurized salt, and that gives it the eggy type flavor. And I'll just dry fry that and serve it on a piece of sourdough bread with tomato, sprouts, greens, and a little avocado. Great brunch or great breakfast for dinner, as Addie would say. So that's one way, but we do eat a lot of tofu in our house, and it's nice to note that it's good for you in a variety of different ways. My dessert each evening is soy milk with frozen banana and frozen blueberries and a little cacao powder. That makes a chocolatey soft serve, so I like that a whole lot. Get my blueberries in for my brain health and diabetes health, as well as my soy milk. So those are my soy tips for today. I'm going to cut this podcast short because, again, next week's going to be pretty long and in-depth. So I will eventually do a race report on Brazos at some point. And next week is the Macy boys. And like I said, I look forward to talking to them about ultra running as well as predominantly Alzheimer's and their new book. So thank you for listening. See you next week.